everybody. I hope you're having a great day today, and I hope you know how loved you are and how much God cares about you and every detail of your life. He's just watching over you. And I think it's so cool, you know, when you look at that concept of God knowing the details of our lives. And it goes back to the very beginning for each one of us, that moment when He knit us together in our mother's womb and He wrote the days of our life in a book. He planned a destiny for us. He planned a purpose for us, something that would be full of Him and full of life and full of love. And when we get ourselves in that perspective and we're looking at our lives through His eyes and we're looking at the destiny that He had planned for us, suddenly our lives make sense. And our personalities make sense, and our giftings make sense, and our passions and compassions make sense. The things that get us excited make sense through God's eyes. And not only does it make sense, it brings Him glory. It is lifting Him high. It is honoring Him. And in our lives, it brings us joy. It brings satisfaction. It's that spot where there's nowhere we'd rather be than in the center of His plan, being who He's made us to be, doing what He's made us to do. And that doesn't mean that it's perfect. And it doesn't mean that it's easy all the time. You know, you will be refined and you will be tested and you will be challenged in different areas. But still, when you know that you are being who God's made you to be, doing what He's made you to do, there's joy in that. And that is not reserved for just the special people of life. Every single person is called by God, picked out, handpicked by Him with a destiny and a purpose and a plan that He has for us. And because it glorifies God and because it brings Him satisfaction, because it brings us joy, we have an enemy that comes against it, and he tries to destroy that destiny. He tries to, get it off track timing wise. He tries to block us at every turn. And really, we have to be alert to the different strategies that the enemy uses to destroy or delay the destiny that God has for us. And I want to just talk about one of those particular strategies today, because I feel like it's something that is rising up all around us. It's an old problem and it's taking on new packaging in today's age. But let's just look at the life of King Saul for a moment. King Saul was a man who was, the people wanted a king. We read in 1 Samuel, the people wanted a king, and so God selected for them somebody who would be a fitting person. It wasn't necessarily God's first choice, but it was the person that would fit for them. And so King Saul was anointed, and God said to him that if he would serve God, if he would live his life according to God's design, that God would guard the kingdom for him. But one of the missions that God sent King Saul out on was to destroy the Amalekites. It was an ancient enemy of Israel. And so King Saul was supposed to go out and he was supposed to completely destroy the enemy. And so when he goes out, he does most of the job. He probably did like 98% of what God asked him to do, but he didn't quite finish it. And at the end of the day, when the prophet Samuel came and he saw what was going on and he saw where the disobedience was, he was horrified and he said, "How could you have done this?" And King Saul answers with a really gut-wrenching sentence and a phrase that I think applies to many of us today. And he said in 1 Samuel 15:24, "I have sinned, for I have transgressed the commandment of the Lord and of your words, because I feared the people and I obeyed their voice." And one of the greatest destroyers of destiny is that fear of man. Fear of man comes in, and it comes in many different packages. It's not something that we, consciously walk into. It's not something that we want to buy into, but it's set as a trap for us. In fact, Proverbs chapter 29 says, "The fear of man brings a snare, but whoever trusts in the Lord shall be safe." And so the interesting thing about a snare is it's something that is packaged up so that we fall into it. It's not something that you necessarily choose. It's something that you fall into because you're baited by it. And the definition of a snare is a trap, a device, something that gets smaller and tighter when the animal tries to escape. Or in our case, it's a trap or a device that gets smaller and tighter when we try to escape. And the further definition is it is something that is deceptively attractive. A snare is not something you would walk into if it wasn't attractive. Well, how is the fear of man attractive? I think evangelist Reinhard Bonnke says it well when he says, don't accept the applause of man, and you won't be destroyed by their criticism. The fear of man is deceptively wrapped in the applause of man. And when we get our eyes on that applause of man, the approval of man, the favor of man, when people come and they like what we're doing and they approve of what we're doing, and everybody gets on board with what we're doing, we really like that. But if that becomes the motivation of what we do, and it becomes the measure of our boundary lines, and it becomes how we decide what we will and will not engage in, suddenly something is wrong. And the reason is we are called to go after God, and the divine destiny is hooked and directly correlated to our pursuit of Him. As we pursue Him, we find out who He says we are, and we find out who He's made us to be and what He wants to do through us. In fact, the Apostle Paul says we actually have to make it a choice. And he says in Galatians 1:10, "For do I now persuade men or God? Or do I seek to please man? For if I still pleased men, I would not be a bondservant of Christ." He's saying that literally you have to make that choice. You don't get to please men or be focused on pleasing men and pleasing God at the same time. It's the snare that is set before us. And as we're in this moment in history where God is calling the church up, and so many of us, more than ever before, I believe, are understanding divine destiny, and we're understanding purpose, and we're believing who God says that we are, and we're believing what He says we can do, and we're stepping out into new things. We're also coming and being affronted with an enemy that is absolutely against most of what God says, all of what God says, but he's against the actions of the church. He's against the actions of God. He's against righteousness. He's against justice. And there's this very, very public battle that's going on right now. And, it's coming in a lot of forums. You know what I'm talking about, the stuff that you're seeing on the news, the stuff that you're seeing on your social media feeds right now. And it's time for the church, if we're going to live the destiny that God has for us, we have to just get our eyes fixed on Him and go after the calling, go after Him, go after what He says. We have to be the men and women that He says we are. We have to do the things that He says we can do. And if we get caught pursuing the applause of man or fearing the criticism or the judgment of man, we will miss our calling. We will miss the thing that God has for us. It is a delayer or a destroyer of destiny. King Saul lived it out. People, men and women all through history have lived it out, where that bait comes in and we care more about what man says than what God says. And I want to just encourage you today. I believe that God is calling you out. I believe that God is calling you up. I believe that He has spoken into your life and He said who you are. He said who you are in Him, and He said what He wants to do through you. But I want to just give you a caution to be alert against that snare of the enemy. It's going to come in a attractive package. It's going to come as bait that is easily bit into. But really, we need to be on guard. We need to stand against it. We need to reject the approval or the judgment of man. Our well done needs to come from the Lord. And I just bless you today in your destiny. You are loved by God. You are called by God. So let's go live the win today.